So this is our network superintendent. Would you welcome with me Dave Phillips this morning?
Thank you, brother. Thank you, Pastor Ken. Wow. Pastor Ken and Brenda are two of our finest, let me tell you that. I love them and their passion for Lewistown, what God is doing here. We're just trusting God for even more. He's got lots of stuff in store for us. That's the good part. Well, the Montana Ministry Network is blessed to have New Life Assembly as a part of it. We have about 84 churches scattered throughout the great state of Montana. And we're united together in mission. We're united together in doctrine. And it's wonderful that we have a campground not too far from here where we can gather together kids, youth, adults, senior adults, just different things that are going to be happening, of course, this coming summer. And I look forward to seeing some of you there so you can be a part of that with us. Well, I have been thinking a lot lately about the different gifts that God gives us. 2 weeks ago, I was with Convoy of Hope. Some of you know they're a kind of a humanitarian outreach. Comes out of Springfield, Missouri. We'll get it there. And Hal Donaldson, the director, was on this particular trip with us to Nicaragua. And I was going to take several of our pastors from the state. 2 of them backed out at the last minute because of deaths either in their family or in their congregation. So I ended up taking 1 pastor with me. But because these pastors dropped out, Hal Donaldson invited a movie director and producer from L.A. To come and be a part of it with us. His name is Mark Williams. Now, I didn't know who Mark Williams is. I don't keep track of that. I mentioned to my brother who lives in L.A. and has worked in this industry that Mark went with us. And he said, "Oh, my goodness, why didn't you invite me?" He said, "This guy is like #1 in L.A. I mean, everybody wants him. He's done all kinds of movies like The Accountant. Some of you know that one. There's one called The Good Thief. Ozark is a series that he did that's probably one of the most popular series out there. And I didn't know any of these things about Mark. What I did know about Mark is Hal said, I don't know where he's at spiritually, but God has called him to come alongside of Convoy of Hope, and he's actually going to do a documentary on Hal's life and how Convoy of Hope started. And so he got to come on the trip at the last minute with us. Now, he's a character, let me tell you. So we were having discussions on the bus as we were driving around, and Mark says to me, he says, "You know, the thing I don't understand about you pastors is you tell the same story every week." I thought, yeah, we do in a way. He said, I'm a producer, and I think you need a new script. So I really contemplated that. I mentioned it to my brother, and he said, I agree 100% with him. And I said, oh, shut up. I don't want to hear from you. When it comes to Jesus, there's so many different facets to who he is. And we get the privilege as we gather together to focus on that, to talk about that, and really to understand that, the depths, the width, if you would, of God and Jesus, who they are and what they want to do in our lives. And so I've been thinking a lot lately about the fact that God is a gift-giving God. That's who he is. And, you know, you don't get the same gift every time somebody gives you a gift. They're different. And that's the way God is. He gives different gifts all the time, depending on what we need, what's going on in our life. I love the different scriptures. I mean, John 3:16, who could say it better? God so loved this world that he gave us his one and only son. I mean, that's our God. He's a giving God. James, the half-brother of Jesus, will write in James chapter 1, verse 5 and say, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, and he will give it generously. Now, the word generously isn't found in the original. You know, we had that because it helps us in English to understand. It's let him ask the giving God. Why do we ask the giving God? Because the giving God gives generously. James goes on in verse 17, and he'll say, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. So that's our God. He loves giving gifts. And I want to talk about one of those gifts this morning. And it's the gift of another chance, the gift of a fresh start. Some of you need to hear that this morning because maybe as you look back over your life, there was a time when you really blew it. And you wondered if things could ever be the same between you and God. Whether or not God still has a plan or God still has a purpose for your life. And I want to show you this morning through Scripture that He does, because that's who He is. You know, it's interesting because we're going to look at John chapter 21, and we're going to see how Jesus approached Peter and offered him the gift of a fresh start. And this encounter was so profound. This encounter was so life-changing. Peter walks away from it an entirely different person. This is how it starts out. Well, it doesn't start. This is kind of the middle section. We'll go to how it starts in a second. But in John chapter 21, verse 15, it simply says, after breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, Peter replied, you know I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said, you know I love you. Then take care of my sheep, Jesus said. A third time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. And he said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said, then feed my sheep. What in the world is happening here? I mean, to be asked the same question 3 times in a row, and you feel like you've answered it, but maybe you haven't. It's interesting. Some scholars, they point out different aspects of this. Some will say, well, you know, there's 2 different words that are used for the term love in the Greek. There's the Greek word agapeo, which is kind of a divine heavenly love, and there's phileo, which is a brotherly love. And so twice Jesus will say to Peter, Peter, do you phileo me? Do you love me with a brotherly love? And Peter will say, well, yeah, Lord, you know I do. And he's saying, well, is that the best you can do? And Peter's like, well, I don't know what else to say. So the third time is, you know, he says, yeah, I mean, I do. I love you with a brotherly love. Well, Jesus didn't speak Greek. He spoke Aramaic. And so Jesus obviously wasn't doing that. That's something John wrote this down in Greek because he's talking to the expanded Roman Empire, and he's got a much bigger audience he's addressing, so he does it in Greek. Other scholars come along and they say, well, we believe that what Jesus is doing is he's given Peter a chance to reaffirm his love for him. 3 times he publicly denied that he even knew Jesus, and now 3 times he's being given the opportunity to publicly say, I love you. Now, if you think of it that way, I think it's kind of nitpicky on Jesus' part. I really don't see him doing that. I want to suggest to you a third thing happening here. If I come home at the end of the day and my wife meets me at the door and says, Dave, we need to talk, my response would just be kind of flippant. Hey, what's up? Dave, I need to know something. Do you love me? And my goodness, we've been married for 47 years. We've known each other for 52, or 51 years. Yeah, I love you. No, Dave, I need to know, do you love me? Well, don't I do this and this and this to show you that I love you? No, Dave, do you love me? Now, I realize in that instance that she's not looking for a flippant answer. Our conversation is going to go somewhere much deeper than I began the conversation with. And I think that's exactly what's happening here between Jesus and Peter. This is going to be a much deeper conversation than Peter thinks it's going to be, because Jesus is trying to do something. He's trying to reveal himself to Peter. He's trying to help him to understand who he is. Well, I want to suggest to you that that's what's happening here. And when you come to John chapter 21, this is actually how this chapter begins. It starts out by saying, after this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. After this refers to after his resurrection. Jesus has revealed himself to Mary. He's revealed himself to the disciples, Thomas being the last one to come into the room. And now for a third time, he's revealing himself to Peter. The key to this chapter, chapter 21, is all about the fact that this is a revelation of who Jesus is. In fact, verse 14 makes that very clear. This was now the third time that Jesus was revealed to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. You know, there again, different times in our life that we need Jesus to reveal himself to us. Because there's so many facets to who Jesus is, so many ways that he wants to work in our lives, that there are times when we need a fresh revelation of who he is to us personally. And especially Peter, you know what he needs in the midst of his feelings of having absolutely blown it. I mean, all the disciples were talking about whether they would ever deny Jesus, and Peter says, you know, you might all deny him, but I never will. So he doesn't need to be reminded of how he absolutely stuck his foot in his mouth and blew it. He needs to be reminded of Jesus' love for him. Let's go back to chapter 21, verse 1 again. So after this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples were together. And Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. They said to him, well, we'll go with you. They went out, they got into the boat, notice these words, but that night they caught nothing. The word night is used by John throughout his gospel account. And usually when he uses that word, there's kind of this ominous, dark undertone. For example, he tells the story of Nicodemus, who was a Pharisee, a leader of Pharisees. He came to Jesus by night. He didn't want to come in the daytime because he was afraid of what people would think if he was seen with Jesus. So he came under the cloak of darkness. John will go on then in chapter 9 and say to the disciples after he's healed the man that was born blind, we have to work while it is day. Why? Because the night comes when no one can work. You can't work effectively in the dark. Now, I had a man who attended my church when I pastored in Missoula, and sad story. He had an eye removed. Actually, found out later that it could have been surgically repaired. He would have been okay. He was working under the dash of his truck, and he had a sharp, like an ice pick. I think it was a tester, and it slid off and went into his other eye. So he's completely blind in probably, I think he was in his late 30s at the time. He was in his early 60s when I knew him. He invited me over to his house one day, and I went there, and he was downstairs working, so his wife took me downstairs to his shop, and he has lathes and all these different things that are operating, and there's no lights on. It's pitch black. Well, he's blind. And so he would do everything by touch. And so he didn't, light was worthless for him. He didn't need it on, but he was a master craftsman because he had learned to fill things. So here Jesus is talking about the fact that of this blind man, we have to do the work while it is day because the night comes when we're not going to be able to work. It'll be dark out. In John 11, Jesus says, if anyone walks at night, he stumbles. Now, we know that. If the moon isn't out and we try to go for a hike at night, we're going to trip over tree branches and different things that are rocks, things that are in the way. And then probably the most pointed of all is when Jesus is sitting at the table with his disciples, and he turns to Judas, and he says to Judas, whatever you're going to do, do it quickly. Judas gets up, and he leaves the table, and John then adds these words, and it was night. It's not just dark outside, it's dark in Judas' soul. The light has dimmed, if not almost been completely extinguished. That's how John uses this term night. There's always something ominous about it. And so we're told that Peter gets into the boat, and John says it's nighttime. He's stumbling. He's dealing with this darkness in his own soul. The light has dimmed. He has failed Jesus miserably. And for some of you, maybe that's where you are, to whatever degree and whatever way you have failed him. Or maybe you feel that he's failed you, because it can go both ways. You prayed for healing didn't happen. You asked the Lord to heal your marriage fell apart. You asked the Lord for help with your job, help with your income, and it never came about. And all of a sudden you find yourself disappointed in the Lord, and invariably when you're disappointed in the Lord, you become disappointed in yourself, and you feel like quitting. You feel like going your own way. Have any of you ever told God that you quit? I have. Sometimes we find ourselves exactly where Peter was at. He's blown it. He's walking away, in essence, going back to the only thing he knew, which was the fishing business. Look again at verses 2 and 3. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, 2 others of his disciples were together. What Peter is doing is going to affect 6 others, and what the 7 disciples do together is going to affect the entire core that Jesus has spent 3.5 years of his life investing into. Can I say to you, be very, very careful what you do with feelings of disappointment, or even feelings of having blown it with God. Because the tenor in which you serve God, love God, process your feelings and disappointments with God will have everything to do with how those around you navigate life. Parents, can I especially say to you, be careful what you say in your home about the church, or even about your own feelings, possibly of disappointment with God, or having disappointed God yourself. Because if you aren't careful, you can embitter your children. You don't always know what the future holds. You don't always understand exactly why the plan of God is unfolding the way it is. You have to trust him as you walk through that. When Peter says, I'm going fishing, the whole future of the church is at stake, and he doesn't even know it. What's interesting is we're told that they went out and they fished all night, but they caught absolutely nothing. Now, the thing they thought they could do, they can no longer do. Why? Because they've experienced Jesus. They've experienced God in their midst. They've watched him raise the dead back to life, heal the blind and the lame, open deaf ears. And now that they've experienced that, they can't go back to their old way of life, because that old way of life doesn't exist anymore. Well, verse 4 goes on, and it tells us, just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus is right there. He knows exactly what they're going through. He knows the struggles that are taking place in their hearts. And they're so disappointed. They're so discouraged. They can't see him. Wow. Can I say to you that in your feelings of failure and your feelings of discouragement, even though you can't see Jesus, I'm absolutely certain that Jesus sees you, and he's standing on the seashore of your life. The God who loves Peter loved you. And when you think that he's nowhere to be found, he's right there, waiting for you. Well, I love verse 5. It goes on. Jesus said to them, children, do you have any fish? They said no. He said to them, well, cast the net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. And I'm sure Thomas said, oh, yeah, like that's going to work. But it's such a bizarre thing to say, okay? If you're fishing and I were to say to you, it's not working on the left side, try the right side of the boat, you'd go, what a dummy. But it's so weird that Jesus says what he says, they actually do it, And all of a sudden they catch so many fish they can't even hardly get the net to shore. I think something pretty cool is happening here. I think Jesus is performing a miracle to open their eyes. I can only imagine that they thought back, when's the last time we were told something like this? It was back in Luke chapter 5 when Jesus first called them. When Jesus first called them, he was teaching the people, and they were on the shore of the lake, and there came so many people that they couldn't do it effectively. So he saw an empty boat there. It happened to be Peter's boat. Peter was washing his nets, having fished all night and caught nothing. And John was washing his nets, so his boat was there. Jesus got into Peter's boat, said, cast out just a little bit, and I'll teach the people. And that way, by backing up, he could address the masses. Well, after he had addressed the masses, he says to Peter, cast out into the deep and let down your net. Peter said, I've done that all night, and I haven't caught anything, but at your word, I'll do that. And so he does. He lets down his net, and he catches so many fish, the net begins to break, and John has to get in his boat and come and help him drag the fish to the seashore. Now, Peter is so overwhelmed by this, he says, depart from me. I'm a sinful man, Lord. And Jesus said, don't fear, Peter. I'm going to make you a fisher of men. And it says when Peter got on the seashore, he and John and James and those that were there left everything to follow Jesus. I imagine that they're thinking this because Peter actually jumps out of the boat into the water to swim to shore faster because they're going, that's got to be Jesus who's telling us this. And he gets there on the seashore. And I believe what Jesus has just done is he's taken them back to that moment, to that time when he became so real to them, they were willing to do anything to follow him. I want to ask you, do you remember that moment in your life when Jesus became real to you? Maybe for the first time in your life you sensed what it was like to have your sins forgiven, to actually be in relationship with the God of the universe. If you're feeling that you've disappointed God or that God has disappointed you, who's changed? Have you changed or has God changed? Here's Jesus showing up on the beach of Peter's life, and he's not there to reprimand Peter. He's there to feed him breakfast. Verse 9 tells us when they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it and bread. I find it really interesting that John calls it a charcoal fire. That word charcoal is only used one other time in the New Testament, and John will use it a few chapters later when he refers to it again. I believe it's chapter 18 of John. And it's taking place on the night that Jesus was betrayed. Jesus has been taken to be tried by the high priest and the council of the Jews. And out in the courtyard are some of the Roman soldiers as well as some of the servants of the high priest. And John says they're standing around a charcoal fire, warming themselves. Peter comes up and he joins them, and it's there that 3 different times different people will say, aren't you one of those disciples? Haven't we seen you before? Peter will say, no, not me. They'll say it the second time. The third time they say it, Peter cusses because he wants them to know, no, I'm not one of those guys. And Peter walks away from that encounter broken, weeping bitterly because he knows he has forsaken the Lord. I want to suggest to you that sometimes certain smells bring back certain memories. When I was a kid, I grew up in outside of Bellevue, Idaho, and actually in Twin Falls, Idaho, but I went to Bellevue, Idaho all the time to our campground. Campground sat on the Big Wood River. There were all kinds of willows and large trees, and when you'd go to that camp, those things emitted such a smell that no matter where I'm at in life today, when I smell that smell, it takes me right back to my childhood memories. And I think that's what's happening here. Peter recognizes the fact that it was the smell of a charcoal fire where he stood and he totally denied ever knowing Jesus. And now all of a sudden there's a charcoal fire, but it's a whole different situation. Jesus is fixing him breakfast. I love that. Jesus will say to Peter then these words in verse 10. Bring some of the fish that you've just caught. So Simon Peter went aboard, hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. Now, none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. And those are the verses that then set up Jesus' conversation with Peter. It's the next verse, verse 15. And when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He's not talking about the other disciples because the last thing they need is a contest of who loves Jesus more. No. He's talking about the fish. He's talking about Peter's old way of life. Peter, do you love me more than understanding the hows and the whys of life? This isn't at all the way Peter thought it was going to end. He's disillusioned. He's hurting. He's disappointed in himself. Some of you have said, what's the use? I've messed up. There's no going back. It's over. No, it's not. Your failures do not change God's love, God's purposes, or God's plan for your life. And Jesus is revealing himself to Peter so that Peter will know that. If in your disappointment you'll say, God, I'm going to pick up where I left off with you, then God is able to work out his will in your life in ways that you could never imagine. I love sharing the story of really my testimony, my family's testimony, and I've done it several times in different places. My mom and dad were not Christ followers, didn't really know anything about the Lord. Yet they married, had a couple of kids, had a terrible relationship with each other. One day they were out fishing on a Labor Day weekend. My uncle joined them and his 2-year-old son. They had their 4-year-old son with them. And as they were going down the lake or the reservoir trolling, the boys were sticking their hands out over the bow of the boat to fill the waves. And suddenly that 2-year-old cousin of mine flipped over the side of the boat and sank like a rock. My dad jumped up from the boat. My uncle jumped up. My mom had never driven a boat. She had no idea what was going on. It was still trolling. And both of those men, fully clothed with jackets on, jumped into the water to try to save my cousin. They had to dive down to the bottom of the lake, and after 1 or 2 times of doing that, both men were absolutely, totally exhausted. But they did locate my cousin Denny, and they pulled him up, and he was okay. They were able to hold him between the two of them while they were staying afloat. And my dad said in that moment, he knew he was drowning. He couldn't breathe. He had just absolutely exhausted himself, taken in water the whole time. And he cried out and he said, you know, God, if you're real and you save me, I will dedicate my life to you. Well, a boat happened to see these 2 men out in the reservoir. My mom had gone the other direction, still trolling. And they go, what is wrong with these 2 idiot men to be out in the middle of the reservoir swimming on a cold day like today? And then they noticed a little boy being held up between them. So they shot their boat over as fast as they could, threw out life preservers, got the men in the boat, and they got them back to shore. When they got to shore, my dad got into the pickup with my mom and brother, and he said to my mom, Laura, I almost drowned out there today. He said, I don't understand it, but everything I'd ever done wrong in my life flashed before my eyes, and I'm going to change. We're going to go to church. We're going to discover who God is. Well, the next Sunday came around and life was happening as normal. They completely forgot. My dad forgot what he had said to God. Another Sunday came and went. Another one came and went. On a Monday morning, my mom was reading a storybook to my brother. My dad had just taken off. He was a traveling salesman for a couple of big meat packing plants. And so he was gone. He was down the road, no cell phones, no way of contacting him. And my brother said to my mom, "I don't feel good." She said, "Well, do you think you're going to throw up?" And he said, "Yes." So she picked him up, she carried him into the bathroom, and she held him over the toilet, and he died instantly in her arms. Took him quite a while to be able to track my dad down. They called his best friend, said, would you go tell Dave the news? So they held him at the store, grocery store that he was at. Couldn't understand why. He was frustrated. They wouldn't tell him what was going on. And his best friend walked in the door and said, "Dave, I don't know how to tell you this, but your son just passed away." My dad described it as though somebody doubled up their fist and hit him as hard as they could in the stomach. He couldn't breathe. He got in the car. His best friend was driving him back home, and his friend never became a believer. But my dad said to him, a number of weeks ago, I had an encounter with God. I told him that I would serve him, and I didn't. I ignored it. And I'm going to change my life. Something's going to change. Well, they didn't have a church, but this best friend of my dad's went to a Lutheran church, and so he said, well, we have a visiting pastor. We don't have a pastor right now. He'll do the funeral for you guys, and so they agreed to that. When they were during the funeral, the pastor shared a little bit of David's story with Bathsheba and how David pleaded with God that the child would not die, and yet the child did die. And David said to all those that were around him, he can't come back to me, but I can go to him. And my mom bowed her head in that moment and said, God, whatever it takes for me to be where my son is, I will do it. Little did they know that their next door neighbor had been praying that God would bring somebody into her life that she could lead to him. She said, God, I don't know how you're going to do this, but I want my life to count. I want to know that I've helped bring somebody into the kingdom of God. When she heard that my brother had died, she came next door, knocked on the door, and told my mom, do you have any peace at all right now in your life? And my mom said, none whatsoever. She said, would you like to come over and have coffee with me? I'd like to share with you how you can have peace in your life. My mom did. She ended up leading her to the Lord. My mom went back home later that day, brought my dad over. She led my dad to the Lord, and their lives were absolutely transformed from that moment on. My dad, throughout his lifetime, would never forget to say, I serve a God of another chance. I told God I would do this. I didn't do it. I blew it. But God still loved me, and he gave me another chance. He didn't blame God for his son's death. He understood that God could use it to change his life, and God did. And they both, my folks, all the time they were alive, would credit the fact that we're in the kingdom of God today because of our son. I'm here this morning to simply remind you that in your disappointments with God, maybe even in your feelings of having failed God, those things will dim your vision of Christ. Just like the disciples, Jesus standing on the shore, if they didn't see him, they didn't know it was him because of those things that were going on in their life. And I find myself like that at times. I fail to see Jesus standing there because I'm so focused on what's happening in my own heart. But Jesus is standing on the shore of our hearts, and he's giving you another chance. He doesn't do it in a condescending way. He doesn't do it in a grudgingly or angry manner. He does it in the most generous, kind, and redemptive way possible. He invites us to come back into relationship with Him. You know, if you will do that, Lord, I'm going to pick up the pieces and I'm going to follow you. He's right there to grab your hand, because that's another facet of who He is. He's the God, not of second chance, but He's the God of new beginnings, fresh beginnings. He's the God who gives us multitude of chances because of His great love for us. So we close in prayer. I just want to remind you that if you know the ABCs, which I trust we all do, you can remember these things of what it takes to get back into relationship with Christ. A, would be simply to admit that you've blown it and you need Him. B is to believe that Jesus is who He said He is. He is the God who can give you a fresh start. He's the God who can forgive you. He's the God that can do new things in your life. And C, commit your life to Him. Those three simple things bring us back into relationship with Him, and they allow God to restore the plans that He had for us in the beginning, as though nothing wrong ever happened. Peter becomes one of the most majestic, powerful figures of the entire New Testament because of what he allowed Jesus to do. He walked away from this, a man who knew he was forgiven, and a man who had a fresh new relationship with Jesus Christ. Would you join me in prayer this morning? Father, I want to thank you for your precious word. Lord, I want to thank you that the story is not the same every week, because it focuses on all the aspects of you and all the things that you do for us. And I'm so thankful, God, that one of the awesome, precious gifts that you extend to us is the gift of a fresh start, the gift of another chance. And Lord, I pray that, Lord, if there's anyone here this morning that needs that to come back to you, that you'll use that in their life, Lord. And I pray you'll use it in all of our lives, that we'll look at people through a different light, that we'll look at them, Lord, with the understanding that you're a God that's reaching your hand out to them. You're a God that's offering them the greatest gift of all. Not just salvation, but the gift of being forgiven and walking in a fresh new way with you. So, Lord, keep working in us. Keep using us. Keep guiding us. And we say thank you. Thank you for the wonderful gift that you are offering to us. We do it in Jesus' precious name.